can hear you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on this day, this week, marking the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. First and foremost, I hope everyone tuning in is able to fully participate and this conversation. If I am to say something good, I am eternally grateful for having the opportunity to express thoughts that are good. And if I am saying anything that harms or offends, I seek absolute forgiveness from everyone. My name is Rabia Khedr. I live on the traditional territories, most recently of the Mississaugas of the New Credit in Mississauga, Ontario, Canada, as it's known. I recognize that these are Indigenous lands inhabited by First Peoples and colonized, and we are all settlers. I commit to truth and reconciliation and disability justice for all Indigenous people on Turtle Island and around the world. I recognize that there are people with disabilities who cannot participate in this virtual space due to the systemic and technological structural barriers that society has not addressed. For those of us that can participate, it is important that we recognize those that are unable to and make sure that we commit to carrying messages forward to them in ways that they can participate. So every one of us sharing and listening has a duty to support and reach out and make those connections with people who cannot participate in virtual space and share learnings and knowledge and experience. So nobody is left behind. Now, I speak from my lived experience. My lived experience goes something like this that I sum up in a one-liner of sorts identity statement. My name is Rabia Khedr. I'm a hyphen with many hijabs, as I like to say, because currently I am wearing and have chosen to wear in most of my adult life since graduating university a head covering, a garment called a hijab, which covers my hair and my neck and my ears. I am currently wearing what I'm told is a peach top with a brown hijab. So I am a hyphen with many hijabs in Canada's multicultural reality. An experiment that I genuinely, wholeheartedly believe in. I believe that we can live together with all our identities equally and thrive as long as we commit to systems change and do our part to address the barriers that we have around us. So, in this hyphenated identity, I package it something like this. I am a Muslim, Pakistani, Punjabi, Canadian woman, wife, mother, daughter of aging parents, sibling of individuals with disabilities, a mother of 4 young adults living in very difficult times today globally, an activist and advocate, somebody who is blind legally, and I don't know what would be illegal about it, is my old joke. But we do legally package disablement and disabilities in many ways. I am a person with a disability. I came to this country as an immigrant child. And as an immigrant child, I am very grateful for the fact that my father was blessed with the wisdom and opportunity to migrate to this land. And regardless of some of our immigration practices, at that point had the opportunity to become a permanent resident and bring myself and my mother here to join him and eventually become citizens. I am grateful for this opportunity because I had opportunities to education, employment, and hence career, family, community, and a voice. And a voice that insists on speaking truth to power to change systems and structures so that every one of us can thrive in this society. 75 years ago, why did we commit to a universal declaration on human rights? Well, the history and atrocities of humanity were horrific. Horrific. Horrific right here, in fact, where we had residential schools for our Indigenous peoples, where we had disabled people institutionalized, and eugenics and sterilization policies, where globally we were rising through World War I and World War II and the Holocaust. A Holocaust where 6 million Jews were annihilated. And before they were annihilated, 200,000 disabled people were experimented upon with technology to put them to death and annihilate them. We rose out of this ugly modern history, and yet the history of people with disabilities hasn't been any better way back when in ancient times. In ancient times, the great ancient civilizations like Greece and Rome did not include disabled people. In fact, when people were born with disabilities, children were born with disabilities, they were eliminated. And I won't dwell on that too much. And in ancient Egypt, they were godified or glorified in oddly exclusionary ways. So throughout history, people with disabilities have made significant contributions to society and have challenged society to learn from their lived experience. And yet they have been dismissed, banished, eliminated, oppressed, victimized, abused, abandoned, impoverished, and so on and so forth. Well, we came out of World War II with this consciousness, this awakening. The world wanted a new way of being in that honoring human rights to become a central value, and nations committed to the UN Declaration. In that fashion, over time, our Canadian experience remained of people with disabilities being institutionalized and isolated from society at large. Slowly, slowly, people came together and said this wasn't good enough, this needed to change. In Ontario, we took our Bill of Rights and modernized it as a human rights code in 1962. We looked at race, religion, eventually gender. It took us quite a while to recognize that discrimination on behalf of disability wasn't good enough either. People with disabilities and their families said that we have the right to live independently, we have the right to live in community, and so on and so forth. And hence we evolved in this country, in the various provinces at various times, in offering more community-based supports and services. Suddenly, it was politically incorrect to lock away people and have them working in workshops and living in conditions that kept them away from able-bodied society and kept them away from opportunities that able-bodied people enjoyed. Fast forward 1982, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Well, disability was almost forgotten again. And the burden of ensuring that it be included rested on the shoulders of disabled people. And disabled people rose up to the challenge. People like David Leposki and others made a lot of noise. And eventually, physical and mental disability became a prohibited ground for discrimination under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and its equality provisions. And so, consequentially, in terms of our human rights codes and other legislation. Well, people with disabilities got some rights. Life didn't get any better. Further advances were made, for example, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act and other modernizing accessibility laws to support the inclusion of people with disabilities across the country. And in 2019, as a country, we adopted the Accessible Canada Act. And prior to that, we became signatories to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So tremendous advancement in legal rights. What does that mean about the realities of disabled people in this country? We had a lot of strong activism marching us through all these changes over decades. And today I feel we have a gap and a need for disabled people to come together and rise up, renewing leadership, bringing new voices forward, making sure that there's truly nothing about us without us to bring the change we would dream and need to see. People with disabilities today are struggling with lack of access to affordable and accessible housing, appropriate health and dental care, access to accommodations on transportation, employment opportunities, inclusive education, and often do not have a seat at the table where they can voice their needs. Decisions are still made and policies are still happening in spaces where they're not fully participating. There's a need for mentorship, training, and investment in the leadership of disabled people so they can fully advocate for themselves. Organizations and some individuals are doing tremendous work to bring forward the issues that people with disabilities are facing. However, the spirit of nothing about us without us needs to resonate in every space where there's a conversation about the needs of disabled people. The role of disabled people has to be centralized. As people with disabilities, we can no longer accept being categorized and labeled and compartmentalized according to our disabilities. We need to recognize that we have power and hope and opportunity because there are legislative advances that give us those opportunities. When there are legislative advances in rights, we have a responsibility. Those of us that know what those rights are have to ensure that we take responsibility to ensure those rights for everybody. For those who can participate in this space and for those who cannot. We live through maybe the greatest event in our history that impacted us right here. And that is the pandemic and the lockdown of 2020, which continued in many ways to be a lockdown of disabled people into 2021, 2022, and 2023. We, in fact, reinstitutionalized people with disabilities because there was nothing about us without us. It was all without us at various levels, where those providing care had more power over those who needed care. And disabled people found themselves living in the margins prior to the pandemic and further in the margins during the pandemic, which continues on today. Poverty deepened for disabled people during the pandemic and deepened even further today. 22% of Canadians lived with a disability, according to the statistics until last week, when we learned that it's in fact 27%. 4 in 10 people living in poverty are disabled in this country. Over 50% of people accessing food banks facing food insecurity are disabled people in this country. This is evidence of the fact that legislative advances haven't truly honored the spirit in which we committed to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, subsequent covenants on social, economic, and political and cultural rights, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and our own provincial and national legislations. We need to renew our commitment as disabled people. We need to come together as deaf and disabled people and express our views and voices as one. Saying truly that there's nothing about us without us all together. That we have power when we come together. That we, in fact, can change what we experience. That we, in fact, can advance our human rights right here for all disabled people. For disabled people that are racialized, that are facing anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all other forms of xenophobia. We need to speak together, not only as people with physical disabilities, as blind people, as deaf people, as people first with intellectual disabilities, as people living with psychiatric disabilities or mental illness, invisible, chemical, episodic disabilities. We need to come together and speak as one voice, express our views as one voice, because The collective can change the world. Disabled people around the world, especially folks with intellectual disabilities around the world, the over 1.3 billion disabled people around the world, of which folks with intellectual disabilities are the worst off, in fact. There is a hierarchy amongst us ourselves where we see our needs and our barriers as more significant than the other. No longer can we compete in this disability politics and build this so-called hierarchy of oppression. No longer can we remain silent when our Black sisters and brothers with disabilities are targeted and victimized. No longer can we stay quiet when our deaf friends don't have access to the interpretation accommodations that they need to fully participate with us. No longer can we stand alone in this fight. We know that there's strength in numbers. We know that people pay attention when we come together. We know this because we know what we've achieved in years gone by. The work to include disability as a prohibited ground in our charter wouldn't have happened without disabled people coming together. The work on the Ontarians with this Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act wouldn't have happened without disabled people coming together. The work on the Accessible Canada Act wouldn't have happened without champions and disabled people coming together. The work to end disability poverty in this country that my peers and I are working on at Disability Without Poverty wouldn't happen if we all didn't come together. Coming together, recognizing there's a problem, coming together and discovering that we have a champion in a position of power whom we need to strengthen, coming together, recognizing that there's a promise on the table and we cannot forget that promise that was made, and making sure that we remind the one who made that promise that it must be kept. Bringing everyone together to recognize that disabled people are the only minority group that every able-bodied person has the potential to become a part of. Disability is not only from birth, but it is also acquired in the journey of life at any stage, whether temporary or permanent. It has a huge potential to come our way as we live through the decades of life. And we need to remind ourselves that we need to build a future where people with disabilities can thrive, because tomorrow it can be any one of us needing those supports to thrive. We need to come together and remind people in positions of power that it's no longer good enough to push policies aside to support people with disabilities because, oh, the economy, oh, other priorities, oh, it's not the right time, oh, wait a minute, we have a global crisis, there's a war, there's a hurricane, there's a tornado, there's an earthquake, there's wildfires. All those contribute to disablement. We have to remind everybody. And more people are becoming disabled today, whether through our environment and climate or man-made catastrophes that cause harm to able-bodied people and leave them disabled. Through weapons of mass destruction, through chemicals being dumped in the sea and into our drinking water eventually, through the harm that we do to our climate. We are causing people to acquire disabilities. And there are people with disabilities already existing because of inherent disabilities. So we need to commit to changing the world. We mark such anniversaries to remind ourselves of what we have achieved and what more has to be done. We have achieved a lot in generations, marking 75 years. But we haven't achieved utopia. Maybe we never will achieve utopia. But if you don't reach for the moon, you won't run into any stars. We have to reach for the moon to create an inclusive and just society where nobody's left behind. For me, that is the Canada Disability Benefit right now. Hoping to end disability poverty, bringing forward the voices and viewpoints of disabled and deaf people from all grassroots communities, racialized, Indigenous, newcomer, refugees, those having faced incarceration and isolation, and who are living in rural and remote communities, who don't have online access, in various ways, who are facing deep and deepening poverty. I cannot watch a disabled person ask for money, whether in virtual space or in person, because they're hungry. I just cannot live with that. All of us need to feel that in our hearts and souls. We have to want for our neighbor what we want for ourselves. We have to want to do unto others as we want others to do unto us. These are fundamental traditions and values deep rooted in our realities of spirituality, of faith, of just common humanity that we have to find in our hearts and souls and believe that we can be good and do good in this society. We have power. We need to exercise it. Although we may feel powerless because of our situations, we still live in a country where there are legal protections and there are good people championing the cause. We need to mobilize those voices and bring them together. We need to remind people that if we end poverty for disabled people, we improve their health status. We improve their dental status. We improve their living situation, their family situation. We give them opportunities to participate because their basic needs are met. How can we expect people to work and volunteer if they can't have a healthy meal, if they don't have a safe and accessible place to live, if they don't have the transportation they need. There are so many lessons that the able-bodied world learned through the pandemic and the accommodations that the able-bodied world made in order to maintain their lifestyles and livelihoods. Working at home because of transportation barriers and healthcare barriers and fears of acquiring the virus. So many provisions were made, so many advantages came to being that benefit disabled people. And today, yet, we are insisting that people must return to work in some places. That no longer is working at home a norm in some amongst some employers. We are pushing people back to the same old. And we have to rise up and say no more. It's not about the same old. We're not building back better. We are building forward a future where nobody's left behind, a future where everybody belongs, a future where disabled people, people with disabilities, regardless of how we label ourselves and the language we prefer to use and the intersectional identities that we carry, unite to voice as one. Voice as one to insist on exercising our rights, to insist on taking the responsibility that we help others exercise their rights so nobody is left behind, so that everybody can thrive. Let's dream of the world we want as people with disabilities and as people who love disabled people in their lives, and ensure that tomorrow is a better tomorrow for everyone. There is always hope and there are always dreams. Let's dream and exercise the realities that we have around us, the rights that we have around us, and create the change that we want to see. I speak from my heart with my lived experience as a racialized Muslim disabled woman who grew up advocating for siblings with disabilities, including intellectual disability. I speak as a mother who wants a better tomorrow for every child in this country and in this world. I speak as a human being that wants no more suffering and hardship for anybody in this country and around the world. Let's close our eyes and imagine that utopia that is within reach. If we put our whole hearts and souls into the effort, every one of us has a contribution to make. And that contribution spirals into change if we all work heart in heart and hand in hand. Thank you.